He had money and a name, but it was behind an unmarked door that he found what no one can sell: meaning. A Latino janitor, invisible to almost everyone, showed him that failure is soil and care is a miracle. And what if the key to your life is already in the hands of someone the world refuses to see? Take a deep breath and come with me. The sentence fell before the first word could even be written. Lucas had no idea where to begin. The exam sheet lay before him like a barren desert where every thought went to die of thirst. Each sigh in the classroom echoed like a judgment, every averted glance like a silent verdict. His heart pounded in his chest, begging for air, begging to escape, begging for anything but another failure. And yet, the silence screamed louder than any trace of courage. When the bell finally rang, he turned in his paper with trembling hands. His classmates brushed past him like a cold wind, carrying with them laughter, whispered remarks, and that pity, the kind that humiliates more than outright contempt. The Reed name, a key that unlocked doors for everyone else, seemed to lock every one of his from within. It wasn't just the test, it was the mirror staring back at him, a boy who had everything and yet nowhere he truly belonged. His soul, spilled inward, seemed to cry out for shelter. As he walked out of the classroom, Lucas swore he would never feel that way again. He swore it, and in the same breath knew it was a lie. Because pain does not bend to promises, it only yields to change. And he had no idea how to change. Crossing the hallway, he felt, just for an instant, that someone was watching him without judgment. A gentle gaze, like one that recognizes an old wound. The day was far from over, but a thread of story was quietly beginning to weave itself. In the empty hallway, a cleaning cart rolled unhurriedly, leaving behind the scent of damp floors and something else, the earthy fragrance of rain visiting a hidden garden. The man pushing the cart wore worn-out gloves and a ring of keys that jingled softly at his belt. His skin was bronze, his hair already streaked with silver, and his calloused hands carried the weight of simple things. When he lifted his eyes, there was no curiosity in them, only respect, as though even a glance required permission. "Tough day?" he asked, his accent faint, his voice quiet, as if it had learned long ago not to disturb the world. Lucas nodded, too drained to invent an answer. The man didn't press further. Instead, he handed him a square of paper towel so he could dry his hands. "Nothing worse than slipping when the floor is clean," he said with a half-smile, as if the words carried two meanings at once. Lucas didn't fully understand, but he felt as though the phrase had understood him. On the cart, tucked between rags and bottles, was a small plastic bag filled with seeds, marked by a handwritten label, Paciencia. Lucas read it and blinked, quietly amused by the misspelling, which somehow spoke louder than 1,000 grammar rules. The man placed the bag back carefully, as though tucking away a secret, and before turning the corner, he gestured discreetly toward a metal door at the end of the hallway, unmarked, save for a thin sliver of light beneath it. The thought of returning the next day began to stir within him, shyly, like a seed pushing against hard soil. At home, silence also had a voice. The Reed mansion lit up the street like a lighthouse, yet inside, everything felt dark. His father was absent, meetings, mergers, headlines, and his mother had learned to speak in short smiles and quiet footsteps, careful not to ignite arguments. Lucas ate dinner alone, listening to the expensive clock tick, so precise it never missed a beat, not even when each second seemed to wound him. "You must honor the name," echoed his father's voice in memory, a lightning bolt splitting his thoughts in two. Out on the balcony, the night smelled of fresh wind. Lucas leaned against the stone railing, counting his breaths, trying to discover where the ache hurt most. Maybe the problem was the name itself, or maybe it was that he had no name of his own, only the weight of someone else's. His mind drifted back to the hallway, to the man with worn gloves, to that small bag of seeds marked with the misspelled word, Paciencia. That tiny, foolish detail stuck like a splinter, and somehow, like a spark. He went inside, pulled out his backpack, and sorted his notebooks with a determination he barely recognized. It wasn't courage, it was necessity. If he couldn't change the past, perhaps he could learn to water what still remained. Before falling asleep, he closed his eyes and saw again the unmarked door, the thin line of light across the polished floor. His weary heart slowed its beat, as if whispering, "Go back." And the story, still invisible, promised to speak louder come morning. Quer que eu siga traduzindo os próximos trechos por para manter a cadência contínua da narrativa, como capítulos que se costuram. Você disse, o veredito veio sem sal e sem olhar. Você está desperdiçando tudo. A voz de Charles Reed cortou o ar da sala de jantar como faca fria, enquanto talheres de prata davam ritmo à humilhação. Lucas tentou responder, mas o silêncio prendeu as palavras no fundo da garganta. O relógio da parede marcava cada segundo, como se fosse uma sentença. Gancho. Quando a Jupai falou, honre o nome, o que ele ouviu por dentro foi, você não tem um. Ele pousou o garfo devagar, medindo a respiração para não tremer. A mãe baixou os olhos, tentando ser ponte onde só havia abismo. Lá fora, o vento balançou as folhas como uma plateia que não queria ver o final. Lucas pensou no corredor da escola, no homem das luvas gastas, no pacote de paciência, um lampejo. Talvez existisse outra forma de existir, além da régua do pai. Na varanda, o ar noturno trouxe um breve descanso, como água fria em pele febril. Lucas encostou a testa no vidro e deixou que o próprio reflexo o encarasse sem exigir nada. O coração desacelerou, e com ele veio a pergunta que mudaria tudo. E se honrar o meu nome for descobrir qual é ele? Lupin. A imagem da porta sem placa brilhou na mente como um convite. O chat GPT disse, aqui está a tradução em inglês americano, mantendo a força poética, o peso emocional e o estilo narrativo longo típico dos canais Love Buster Show e Wild West Love Stories. The verdict came without flavor, without even a glance. You're wasting everything. Charles Reed's voice cut through the dining room like a cold blade, while the silverware kept time with the rhythm of humiliation. Lucas tried to answer, but silence trapped his words deep in his throat. The clock on the wall marked each second as if it were a sentence being handed down. When his father said, honor the name, what Lucas truly heard inside was, you don't have one. He set his fork down slowly, measuring his breath so his hands wouldn't shake. His mother lowered her gaze, trying to become a bridge where only an abyss existed. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves like an audience unwilling to watch the ending. Lucas thought of the school hallway, of the man with the worn gloves, of the small bag marked Paciencia. Perhaps there was another way to exist beyond his father's harsh measure. Out on the balcony, the night air offered a brief reprieve, like cool water on fevered skin. Lucas leaned his forehead against the glass, letting his reflection stare back without asking anything of him. His heart slowed, and with it rose the question that would change everything. What if honoring my name means discovering what it really is? The image of the unmarked door gleamed in his mind like an invitation. In the auditorium, the top students were called forward to receive their certificates. The applause echoed like rain outside a house where he was never allowed in. Lucas kept a polite smile, but inside a storm raged. Tearing shingles from the roof he was still trying to hold up. The school's camera swept past him without stopping. His face was treated like the pause between two moments of importance. When the ceremony ended, he walked down a side corridor where the lights were dim and the floor still smelled of cleaning solution. His father's voice thundered back into memory, but now something new blended with it. The janitor's words, nothing worse than slipping when the floor is clean, suddenly made sense. The fall that hurts the most is the one that comes when you think you're ready. Near the service exit, Lucas leaned against the wall and breathed, counting silently to 8, the way he had once seen athletes do before a jump. In that stillness, the pain lost a little of its height. He decided he wouldn't run from the emptiness of that night. Looping. In the distance, the metallic jingle of keys announced the one man he was finally ready to listen to. Quer que eu siga traduzindo cada trecho como se fosse parte de roteiro narrado completo, costurando-os para formar uma história longa de 40 a 50 minutos. No mesmo estilo de vídeo viral do YouTube, você disse, na manhã seguinte, o prédio ainda acordava quando Lucas chegou cedo demais para qualquer aluno e tarde demais para abandonar a ideia. A luz, inclinada pelas janelas altas, desenhava faixas no chão encerado, como trilhos para quem quisesse partir. Miguel já estava lá, checando o carrinho, e levantou o rosto com um bom dia que soou como "eu sabia que você viria". Gancho. Não era só um cumprimento, era a confirmação de um caminho. Diante da porta, sem placa, Miguel inseriu a chave e esperou um segundo, como quem pede licença ao passado. Nem tudo precisa de nome para ter valor, disse, e empurrou devagar. O ar que saiu de lá tinha cheiro de coisa guardada e, curiosamente, de terra depois da chuva. Lucas sentiu a pele arrepiar, como se estivesse pisando dentro de um segredo. Eles não entraram ainda. Miguel fechou de novo, sorrindo. Algumas portas precisam de preparação. Ou a gente entra e não enxerga nada. Ele entregou a Lucas o saquinho de coragem e bateu de leve no ombro do garoto. Hoje, aprende a olhar. Lupin. Por trás do metal, algo vivo parecia respirar, esperando o momento certo para nascer. The next morning, the building was still waking up when Lucas arrived. Too early for any student, yet too late to abandon the idea. Light slanted through the tall windows, tracing bands across the polished floor like rails for those ready to leave. Miguel was already there, checking over his cart, and when he lifted his head, his good morning sounded more like, "I knew you'd come." It wasn't just a greeting, it was the confirmation of a path. Before the unmarked door, Miguel slid the key into the lock and paused for a second, as though asking permission from the past. "Not everything needs a name to have value," he said, and slowly pushed it open. The air that escaped smelled of things long kept, and strangely, of earth after rain. Lucas felt his skin prickle, as if he were stepping into the heart of a secret, but they did not enter. Miguel closed the door again, smiling. Some doors need preparation, or else we step inside and see nothing. He handed Lucas the small bag marked Corajan and tapped his shoulder gently. Today, learn to see. Behind the metal, something alive seemed to breathe, waiting for the right moment to be born. Miguel walked beside Lucas without hurry, like a man unafraid of losing time because he already knew what he was looking for. "Seeing isn't just with your eyes," he said, pointing to small marks along the baseboard that no one ever noticed. Flecks of old paint, a scratch from a pen, a sticker nearly faded to nothing. This school tells the story of everyone who's passed through it. For the first time, Lucas felt his chest grow calm. The hallway was no longer a tunnel of judgment, but an open notebook. "Silence speaks," Miguel went on, pressing his ear gently against the metal door. "When we respect it, it answers." Lucas's breathing slowed, and a memory returned. His father's raised voice, the clock hammering each second, his own body folding inward. Here, the opposite was true. The quieter they became, the more things seemed to exist. The smell of bleach blended with a subtle fragrance of damp earth, as if a hidden garden were breathing just beyond the metal. "Those who only see dirt will never find a miracle," Miguel said with a quiet smile, adjusting the ring of keys at his side. The word miracle lodged in Lucas's heart, like a seed finally given a name. He noticed a thin beam of light escaping through the doorframe, slender as hope itself. The question rose on its own. What if all my life I've been looking the wrong way? The key, turning lightly in Miguel's fingers, chimed like a bell calling him inside. "If you step in, take care," Miguel warned before turning the key. There was no challenge in his voice, only an ancient kind of pact, the kind that gives new names to old things. Lucas nodded with the solemnity of someone signing his own fate. "I'll take care," he answered. The words were small on the outside, but inside they opened a wide space, like a window unlocked after years. His heart beat stronger, and for once it didn't hurt. The door yielded slightly, releasing a breath of cool, damp air. In the dimness, silhouettes took shape. Shelves, the outline of pots, and something that looked like a low bed of soil. The sound of steady dripping echoed like heartbeats, like life itself. Miguel didn't flood the place with light. Instead, he let Lucas's eyes learn the shadows, the way one enters a church, slowly, reverently, understanding the silence before the vision. "That's enough for today," Miguel said, closing the door softly. "Tomorrow morning, with the right light, you'll see." As he spoke, he placed a small metal trowel in Lucas's hand, along with the same bag marked Corrigan. The weight was heavy, but in the way responsibility can feel good. The night ahead already seemed like a short bridge leading toward what would be born with the dawn. Morning spilled through the tall, stained glass window, making the metal shimmer. When Miguel opened the door, light poured into a world that looked nothing like the storage room Lucas had imagined. Clay pots stood in rows like a small city. Shallow beds of dark soil stretched along the floor. Leaves glimmered quietly, and a shy rosebush struggled to learn its own red. The air carried the fragrance of beginnings, the kind that smells of rain and promises. "I come before my shift," Miguel explained, adjusting a dented watering can. "No one needs to know. What matters is the growing." Crooked labels clung to some of the pots. Esperanza, Paz, Perdao. Lucas smiled with the kind of wonder only imperfection can bring. Each word seemed to wave at a hidden part of him that had been silent for far too long. Here, nothing was grand, but everything was alive. "Everything that grows first dies as a seed," Miguel said, carving a small hollow with the trowel. "We bury it not to lose it, but so it can be born different." Lucas listened, and without realizing, straightened his posture, as if receiving sacred instruction. His heart, once chaotic, found a gentler rhythm. Miguel lifted a plain brown envelope and gave it a soft shake. Inside, the first mission. Miguel poured a few seeds into the palm of Lucas's hand. They were tiny, almost nothing, yet their weight felt heavier than 1,000 expectations. "Don't rush," he instructed. "The soil recognizes who touches it." Lucas drew in a deep breath, and with fingers that trembled less this time, carved a thin groove. The seed disappeared as if surrendering, and the earth closed over it with the gentleness of an embrace. "Routine is the name of the miracle we rarely notice," Miguel said, pinning a calendar to the corkboard. "Water in the morning, pull weeds in the afternoon, observe at day's end. Failure is soil, care is water. The rest belongs to God and time." The words landed firmly in Lucas's memory. He wrote them down in his notebook, like a student learning a language that finally made sense. Before they left, Miguel placed a small sign in the freshly planted pot. Name. Lucas understood without translation. It was about discovering who he was when no applause was given. The door closed softly, and the hallway smelled of future. Outside, the tests, the stairs, and his father remained the same. But something inside him had been watered, and it was asking for the next page. The first test wasn't the soil. It was the clock. Lucas longed for signs, for applause from nature, for anything that might say, "You didn't fail again." Miguel only smiled, patient. A miracle doesn't obey haste. The words struck like cold water and warm light all at once. If he couldn't speed up life, perhaps he could slow down his own restlessness. The following days became a ritual. Arrive early, water sparingly, pull 2 weeds, observe in silence. Lucas began to notice things he had never named within himself. The weight of his breathing, the steadiness in his hands, the way the heart shifts its rhythm when it learns to care. The school remained noisy, but in between the pounding footsteps of the hallway, there was now a place only the two of them knew. The world still demanded results. Here, presence alone was enough. By Friday, leaning his face close to the rim of the pot, Lucas saw a speck of green break the surface, timid, as if asking permission to exist. It wasn't victory, it was promise. He held back his smile between his teeth, careful not to startle it into retreat. Miguel rested a hand on the boy's shoulder and whispered, "See?" Silence answers. The hook arrived on an ordinary afternoon, when no one else was paying attention. "You know what I like most about these hallways?" Miguel asked, pushing the mop with the rhythm of someone in prayer. "They keep everything, and they accuse no one." Lucas chuckled, half in disbelief that a floor could be so generous. But as he walked slowly, he began to notice dry sneaker prints, a strand of colored hair, a candy wrapper left behind, chapters of other lives written on open pages. "To see is to listen with your eyes," Miguel added, picking up what mattered and letting the rest learn how to fade away. Lucas thought about how many times he had rushed through that same corridor without realizing it was giving the world back clean, ready to begin again. Miguel's care wasn't just cleaning, it was interpretation. And in that moment, the boy understood he could also reread his own story without tearing out the pages. They stopped in front of the garden door. Once again, the air carried the scent of soil and promise. Lucas felt his chest expand like a window thrown open after a long, difficult night. "What did the hallway tell you today?" Miguel asked with a teasing smile. "That everyone leaves a trace," Lucas answered. Thought of his father, his teachers, himself, and decided that from now on, he would choose what kind of trace to leave behind. "Why do you stay?" Lucas asked bluntly. Why don't you try for something bigger? Miguel leaned his back against the wall, his gaze wandering through memories that seemed to carry their own scent and color. Bigger for who? He replied, with a gentleness that didn't wound. My father came from the hills of Michoacan. He taught me that work is sacred when the heart is cleaned along with the floor. He spoke of jobs that never lasted, of doors that closed because of his accent, of the first winter when he learned to warm a home with stories. He told of the day he realized dignity doesn't depend on the address printed on a badge, but on what we plant when no one is watching. Lucas listened fully. For the first time, his silence wasn't shame, it was attention. I stayed because here I plant, Miguel concluded, without a trace of heroism. And because some boys need a garden before they need a diploma. The words entered Lucas like a light that doesn't strike, but fills. Without warning, he found himself included in that category, someone who needed to be born again. The small sprout in the pot seemed to look back at him, confirming that the right question had already been asked. What if I'm never good enough? Lucas let the question escape, a breath that had been held for years. Miguel set the small trowel aside, as if laying down an ancient weapon. Then you learn to be fertile. The boy frowned, and Miguel added softly, failure isn't an ending, it's soil. We decide whether to rot on top of it or to become good ground for the next seed. It was the first time they had spoken fear by its true name, without hiding their hands. They walked over to the timid rosebush. It has thorns because it protects what will one day give fragrance, Miguel said, trimming a branch with care. Pain has a purpose, too. Lucas drew in a deep breath and felt his chest open enough to hold that idea. His father had always used pain as a ruler. Here, Miguel turned it into a tool. It was another language, but it sounded like home. Let's make a deal, Miguel proposed, lifting the corkboard calendar. Every exam you take becomes a task of care here. Mistakes don't expel you from the garden, they bring you to it. Lucas nodded, his eyes wet but holding back the tears. For the first time, he realized there was a place where failure was not exile, but invitation. From the hallway came the faint jingle of keys, and it sounded like opening music for all that was still to be born. He arrived at school early, but inside he was years late. He found Miguel polishing a doorframe with the patience of someone who knows that shine is nothing more than persistence. My father said I'm a disgrace. The words escaped unprepared, like a wound that refuses a bandage. Miguel didn't answer right away. He cleaned one more corner, and only then lifted his face. Disgrace is abandoning what depends on us. They walked to the garden door. There, the air supported instead of crushing. Lucas sat on the wooden bench, his hands covering his face, his breath stumbling. I'm afraid I'll never be enough, he confessed. And once fear was given a name, it shrank a little. Miguel sat beside him, not too close, not too far. Enough for who? The question opened space. The automatic answers, for my father, for the school, for the family name, lost their urgency. They stayed in silence, listening to the dripping water that measured time in a more human rhythm. Miguel reached for the corkboard calendar. Today is for pulling weeds. It was both invitation and direction. With the trowel in hand, Lucas's grip trembled less than it had under yesterday's verdict. When I was your age, Miguel began, loosening the memory with a sad smile. My job was hauling stones for the neighbor's wall. He spoke of the sun that cracked the ground, of his mother's lilting Spanish telling him paciencia, of the day he spilled half a cartload and the foreman laughed at his accent when he tried to apologize. I wanted to disappear. My father only said, pick it up again and learn the weight. Then came the memories of his first winter in the United States. Cheap gloves, broken English, pride too big to fit into his pocket. I thought the world owed me respect, but I learned that if I cared well for what passed through my hands, I slept better at night. There was no heroism in his voice, only solid ground. Lucas understood. Miguel's secret wasn't to never fail. It was to always return. Stone doesn't get offended. Stone waits for the right hand, he concluded, setting a pot carefully back into place. Inside, Lucas's body straightened, as if discovering a posture that no longer hurt. If the reed name weighed like a wall, maybe it was time to build life stone by stone. On the board, Miguel pointed to the next task of care, and the routine sounded like salvation. Today I didn't run, he thought. Arriving before the school had fully awakened, the hallway was still yawning. The scent of damp soil greeted him without demands. Miguel waited with the watering can. Courage is repeated presence. The words fell like water on cracked ground. Maybe his courage had always been too loud to last. They divided the task. Lucas watered lightly, counting each drop. Miguel trimmed leaves, removing shadows that stole strength from the sprout. The silence between them was not empty. It was fertile ground. With every right gesture, the boy's heart found its rhythm, as if discovering an inner metronome. For the first time, discipline didn't taste like punishment. It tasted like care. In the end, Miguel placed another small sign, respiration. Lucas smiled, understanding that the body too was a vessel. When the world presses in, return to the rhythm, Miguel said, touching the boy's chest lightly. Outside, the school roared back to its usual noise. Inside, there was a new cadence. The dented watering can became a talisman. The test already had a date. Fear now had a routine. It rained lightly, one of those days when the gray itself seems to speak with discouragement. Lucas thought about not going. Why try again? The memory of the glass office still throbbed like a wound the water refused to stop touching. Even so, he laced up his sneakers like someone forcing open a door from the inside and left while the house still smelled of coffee and silence. Sometimes, courage is nothing more than not turning off the alarm. Miguel was already in the hallway, sleeves rolled up, patience woven into every gesture. Courage also shows up late, but it still shows up, he said without reproach. When you don't feel like coming, promise yourself 5 minutes. Just 5. Lucas nodded, drenched both inside and out. 5 minutes turned into 10, then 15. He pulled 2 weeds, dried the door frame, counted drops as if stitching his own breath back together. The rain struck the tin roof like the metronome of the soul. By the end, Miguel marked a small, drop-shaped symbol on the calendar. Write down the hard days. They count too. Lucas smiled faintly, with the quiet certainty of someone who hadn't conquered anything grand, but hadn't lost himself either. The seed of constancy had broken through the clay. In class, he raised his hand. The teacher frowned, classmates snickered under their breath, and still Lucas asked, "Could you explain it another way?" His voice didn't tremble quite as much. He received the explanation, wrote it down slowly, and felt his heart beat to a rhythm that wasn't so frightening. That afternoon, he went to tutoring. At the top of the page he wrote, "I don't know." He left with a single green check mark, small as a sprout, vast as a horizon. Back in the garden, he told Miguel everything. Miguel listened as if watering from within. "A green check is the start of a root," he said, sticking into the pot a crooked sign that read, "Coragen." The misspelling gleamed like a smile. On one of the rose bushes, a timid bud appeared, wrapped in red. It carried no fragrance yet, but it promised. Lucas stood staring at that almost, and the almost seemed to stare back. "Tomorrow there will be more," he said, and it didn't sound like a threat. The washed hallway returned to him a reflection that no longer hurt. On the wall of his mind, the word miracle ceased to be distant and became a routine sketched in pencil. Aqui está a tradução em inglês americano, preservando o tom poético, reflexivo e cinematográfico no estilo narrativo de Love Buster Show e Wild West Love Stories. The room smelled of new paper and old nerves. Lucas sat down, breathed in counts of 8, touched his chest lightly, a reminder that the body, too, is a vessel. When the test was turned over, he began with what he knew, unashamed to skip what hurt. The clock moved quickly, but for the first time, he moved with it, not behind it. Writing felt like carving furrows, each line a seed. He froze on 2 questions, closing his eyes for a moment. He heard the imagined rain on the tin roof, remembered the rosebud that had not yet found its fragrance. Routine, not haste, he repeated silently. He returned, rewrote, took risks where once he would have surrendered. His heart pounded loudly, but it no longer begged for escape. It asked for focus. When he handed it in, he didn't search for anyone's eyes. He put away his pen as if storing a sacred tool and walked out with steady steps, even without certainty. In the hallway, the air seemed lighter. The garden was waiting, and that was enough. Sometimes victory is simply not running from the silence that follows. During the break, a classmate leaned against the locker and whispered, "If you want, "I've got the answer key for the next one." The folded paper looked light, like a pocket-sized sin. For a second, Lucas felt the old hunger for shortcuts, the kind that offer plastic flowers, pretty from afar, but without roots, without fragrance. His father's face flashed like lightning. Miguel's stayed, like a lighthouse. "No thanks," he replied, walking away before doubt could invent its brilliant arguments. "In the garden," he told Miguel, who simply said, "Roots don't grow in shortcuts." Then he pointed to the red bud. "Fragrance takes time, but it comes." Lucas pressed his nose to the almost fragrance and laughed quietly at his own impatience. That night, the mansion was quieter than usual. He studied a little, watered the plant inside his chest with measured breaths, and thought about the paper he had refused. There was a certain warmth in his stomach, something like hunger, but not quite. It was a good fire, the kind that cooks patience, and this fire, he decided, would not go out. The papers returned through the classroom like a restrained tide. When the test landed on Lucas's desk, the number written there was neither humiliation nor triumph. It was progress. More than the grade itself, the green ink comments said, "Good reasoning here, great attempt there." His heart didn't race, it settled. For the first time, he allowed himself a smile without an audience. In the garden, Miguel listened to the story slowly, as if watering from within before speaking. "Root first, flower later," he said, pointing to the rosebush that had finally opened a sliver of red. The fragrance was still shy, but it was fragrant. Lucas leaned in, inhaled, and laughed at the impatience he'd felt yesterday. Today, it seemed like a tired child asking to be carried by routine. "I want to show my father," he ventured. Miguel said neither yes nor no. He simply placed the sign Paciencia in the right pot and touched the boy's shoulder. "Show yourself first." On the way out, the hallway returned a reflection that no longer hurt. And that night, through the mansion window, a greater test than any exam seemed to be waiting. Dinner began with silverware and ended with invisible shards. Lucas placed the test beside his plate, searching his father's face for even an inch of shelter. Charles read the grade as one might read a grim forecast for business. "This is the minimum, and the minimum with our name is still a disgrace." The word returned heavy, like a soaked stone, yet this time it found less room to sink. "I'm really trying," Lucas said, his voice steady for a moment before fraying like a thread pulled too tight. His father set down his fork, lifted his chin, spoke of transfers, of toughening the boy up, of removing distractions. His mother tried to stitch a truce with her eyes, but the fabric tore with the first pull. The air grew short, like a shirt 2 sizes too small. Lucas gathered the test without folding it. There was no scream in his body, only a silent boundary. "I'll come back when you can talk to me without breaking my name," he told himself, and aloud only, "I'm finished." He rose slowly, like someone lifting roots from a pot without wounding the walls. The front door felt lighter than any explanation. The sidewalk breathed cold, and he breathed with it. His backpack carried little: a jacket, a notebook, the envelope of seeds. Each step scraped at the marble memories of the mansion, but it didn't uproot the new ground he had been planting. His phone buzzed twice. Messages from his father, no questions, only commands. He switched it to silent and kept walking toward the only place where silence ever answered. At night, the school looked like a deserted church. Emergency lights painted a hallway of green veils. Behind the unmarked door, the garden slept awake, guarding the quiet breath of leaves. Lucas sat on the bench and stayed there, closed on the outside, open within. The steady dripping reminded him that time ran on more than one clock. The sound of keys arrived like good news. Miguel appeared with a thermos and 2 cups. "Cinnamon tea doesn't fix everything, but it helps the talking," he said, sitting down without asking for explanation. Lucas didn't need to recount the whole dinner. It was enough to show the folded test and the silence it had received. Miguel nodded like a man recognizing an old acquaintance. "Tonight you sleep at my place," Miguel said, as simply as someone pointing toward a familiar path. "Tomorrow we'll decide the rest with a head that's already awake." There was no charity in his voice, only the sound of chosen family. They left through the side gate, and the night, which had once ached, turned into a thin blanket. Miguel's house was small, carrying the scent of coffee, soap, and old photographs. On the table, a picture frame showed a boy smiling on a bicycle, The image lingered a second longer in Lucas's eyes, though he didn't know why. They ate bread with butter, talked about the dented watering can, about the stubborn sprout, about the kind of courage that arrives late. When the improvised bed finally received his body, he realized his heart was breathing like a well-watered plant. Before turning out the light, Miguel set the ring of keys on the dresser. "Some doors we only open from the inside," he said, without explanation. Lucas closed his eyes and felt that the word miracle was no longer theory. It was a kind of rest. Outside, the night itself was tending the garden. Inside, a new boy had begun to learn his own name. Morning at Miguel's house smelled of coffee and toasted bread and carried a silence that didn't humiliate, it sheltered. Lucas woke to the soft creak of the door and sunlight slipping through the cracks as if politely asking permission. On the sideboard sat old photographs, a blue bicycle, a red kite, a boy with laughter in his eyes. His heart recognized that joy from somewhere he had never lived. "Did you sleep a little?" Miguel asked, setting water to boil. "Enough for today," Lucas replied, and the words sounded grown in his own mouth. His eyes returned to the picture of the bicycle. "Is that your son?" Miguel nodded, without haste and without hiding the word. "Diego," he said, as though placing his hand on a name that still carried warmth. They ate in a good silence. The simple table offered shelter without questions. When they stepped outside, the street breathed cold, but the walk to school felt shorter. Lucas carried his light backpack, and inside it, something new weighed just enough. The desire to understand why some doors only open slowly. In the garden, the light slanted in, sweeping the dust from the air. Miguel watered the rose bush as though speaking with someone beloved. "Diego loved to run when the wind blew," he began, his voice carrying no drama, only a path. "He used to say the wind had a name, and that it answered when we called it." Lucas stayed quiet, his eyes following the water as it sank into the soil without a sound. "One day, the wind was too strong on the road," Miguel continued. "Small car, too much hurry. Life changed its address. There were no details of the accident, no plea for pity, only a father who had learned to keep his son where the wind could not carry him away, in the daily act of care. It was in the silence after him that I learned the weight of a name," Miguel said, touching the wooden sign that read, "Name." Lucas felt his chest ache, but not as it had before. This pain was different, like the crack of a seed breaking open to be born. "I'm sorry," he managed to say, and the words weren't meant to cover a hole, but to water alongside him. The steady drip from the pipe kept count in human time. Somewhere nearby, a leaf turned the page. "Some days I talk to God in the hallway," Miguel confessed with a faint smile. "Other days, I just sweep." Lucas drew in a deep breath, and for the first time, he cried without fighting the tears. It wasn't weakness, it was encounter. Miguel didn't embrace him right away. He let the crying happen, like rain the earth has been asking for. Then he placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, gentle, sufficient. "If you'd like, we can plant one seedling for Diego and another for you," he suggested. They prepared 2 sibling pots. One sign read Diego, the other Lucas. The soil received each seed with a sound only the heart can hear. "A miracle isn't forgetting," Miguel said. "It's remembering in the way that helps you grow." When they closed the door, the hallway returned a new reflection. 2 names standing, still small, but alive. Lucas walked out carrying in his chest a quiet promise to honor the boy he had never known and the man he was just beginning to meet within himself. Outside, the wind had a face. At the garden table, Miguel sketched a simple plan on brown paper. Morning for study, afternoon for care, evening for rest. "Discipline is an embrace, not a rope," he explained. Lucas copied everything into his notebook and set a quiet alarm on his phone. Not to obey a prison, but to remember a commitment to what was being born. Routine found its place, and fear began to lose its hold. He chose a new notebook and wrote on the cover, without haste, "Second Chance." On the first page, a prayer with no name attached, only a request for breath. Beneath it, 3 small, possible goals. Beside them, he stapled a miniature version of the corkboard calendar, with little drops and leaves drawn in pencil, each symbol a promise of care. That afternoon, he helped Miguel rebuild a garden bed, removing stones, returning soil, leveling hope. He discovered that the body thinks when the hands are working. On his way out, he stopped by the teacher's lounge and asked, without shame, about math tutoring. He received a schedule and a simple goodwill counts worth more than any speech. Night arrived with a good kind of tiredness and the certainty that flowers never bloom on the first day. But the soil already recognized his touch. The news arrived on a simple sheet of paper, a quiz with a grade that months earlier would have seemed impossible. It wasn't brilliant, but it was clean. No shortcuts, no shame. Lucas read the teacher's notes, great progress, keep going, and felt his heart settle, like a bird finally finding a steady branch. He didn't run to show anyone. He went straight to the garden, where victories never required an audience. Miguel listened and simply gestured with his chin toward the rosebush. The bud had opened another inch. Its fragrance now existed, shy but real. An honest fruit is light to carry, he said, handing Lucas the dented watering can. Lucas watered slowly, as if giving thanks with his hands. On the corkboard calendar, he drew a tiny leaf beside the date, not a trophy, but a reminder. On his way out, a classmate who had repeated the year asked for help with exercises. Lucas breathed, pulled up a chair, and explained from the beginning, without rushing time. He discovered that teaching was like pulling weeds, less glamour, more care. The hallway returned the scene in silence, and that silence, that day, smelled like home. Yet on the other end of the phone, a message from his father flashed like a siren. There were good days and then one bad. A rushed morning, forgetting to water, the soil turning dry like a harsh word. When he noticed, Lucas felt that old guilt knocking at his door. But instead of punishing himself, he ran to the garden and made it right. The right water, the right shade, an apology without drama. Miguel nodded, satisfied with the invisible gesture. In life, what withers is an invitation. Whoever waters returns. He reinforced the ritual, breathing in counts of 8 before every test, walking slowly through the hallways as a reading of his own body, a verse kept without being quoted. Peace, written on a crooked little sign. Fear still existed, but now it had a place, a name, a treatment. It was less a monster, more a weather pattern. Some days cloudy, others bright, and always a garden. That night, Lucas sent a short message to his mother. I'm trying the right way. She replied with a shy heart emoji that said more than any speech. Minutes later, his father called without warning. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. We need to talk. His voice was cold as glass. Lucas drew a breath, looked at the sign that read name, and understood the conversation would be about more than a grade. The wind of the house stirred inside him, preparing the door that was about to come. The office was the same glass aquarium as always, but Lucas didn't walk in like a frightened fish. He arrived on time, sat upright, anchored his breath to his chest, and let the clock do its work, without doing the work for him. Charles Reed began with numbers, statistics, a plan for transferring him to a boarding school in another state. Words like excellence, dynasty, standard fell heavy, like tools on a marble table. You need to understand what it means to be a Reed, his father said, without blinking. Lucas looked down at his own hands and saw in them traces of soil that no water could wash away, only time. I understand what it means to be Lucas, he answered, low but steady. The phrase wasn't defiance, it was birth. The air in the room shifted, like when rain begins and the city hasn't noticed yet. Charles leaned forward, his eyes 2 points of steel. If you leave this room thinking this is your choice, you'll learn the hard way. Lucas drew another breath, and it hurt less. He remembered the unmarked garden, the door that opened slowly, the name carved on wood. I'm not leaving. I'm staying in myself. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was a bridge, and on the other side, something was waiting with the wind in its face. Charles recited numbers as if laying bricks, the cost of tutoring, rankings, the names of families that never falter. Each figure came with the cement of threat. Lucas listened through to the end, holding his breath like someone carrying a full vessel. When he finally spoke, he placed the words on the table with care. I'll accept what I owe, but I won't accept what deforms me. His voice didn't rise, it settled. His father gave a short laugh, humorless. You mistake stubbornness for character. Lucas breathed through his nose in counts of 8 and let the provocation leave on its own. Character is what remains when the applause is gone, he answered. In the glass of that aquarium, he saw his own reflection without shame. A face without metals, but with roots. For an instant, the room felt smaller than what was unfolding inside him. His mother parted her lips, then abandoned the bridge. She knew in that moment the river had to run alone. Lucas rose slowly, as though shielding a sprout from the wind. I will keep studying, and I will keep tending to what makes me whole. He didn't slam the door. He simply left, leaving one word behind in the air, whole, a word that refused to break. In the hallway, the silence felt like a hospital before visiting hours, heavy, yet waiting for breath. Lucas placed his hand on the cold wall and realized it no longer pushed him back into the aquarium. The elevator descended like someone returning him to ground level. On the sidewalk, the wind ran its fingers through his hair and carried away the last trace of guilt that still lingered. Behind him, on the 6th floor, Charles stared at the empty chair. His hand touched the edge of the table and trembled by a fraction. He remembered his own father, the day he had promised never to raise a weak son, and realized, with bitter surprise, that he had confused strength with noise, roots with varnish. His wife closed the laptop, lowered her eyes, and prayed wordlessly that the line drawn in that encounter would not turn into a wall. Lucas walked lightly back to school. It was late afternoon. The light had the color of a second chance. When he opened the unmarked door, the scent of soil embraced his body like a hug. Miguel was waiting, a rag over his shoulder, and the ring of keys in his hand. Well, it didn't break, Lucas answered. The janitor smiled faintly. What has roots may bend, but it will not snap. Night settled gently over the garden beds, promising bloom. The next morning, the garden looked as though it had slept little, the kind of sleeplessness caused by joy. The rosebush, once timid, had opened 3 red mouths. Its fragrance was no longer a promise. It was presence. Lucas closed his eyes and let the air enter slowly, as though learning a new language through his nose. His heart, which had so often run without direction, now kept steady rhythm. Miguel appeared with the dented watering can, more dented than ever, and a quiet pride in his eyes. Fragrance is when the miracle becomes public, he said, pressing the metal against the dark soil. In one corner, the 2 sibling pots, Diego and Lucas, held sprouts already in need of stakes. There was too much life for too little space, a good problem to have. Outside, the hallway waited its turn to be washed by the same patient. Today we transplant, Miguel announced. They worked with cupped hands, protecting both root and memory. With every handful of soil, Lucas felt something inside him also finding its place. At the end, a new sign was planted, home. The word landed softly, a house not of address, but of belonging. And the wind, sweeping through the tall window, carried the fragrance down the hallway like good news choosing its own path. The fragrance slipped through the unmarked door and spilled into the hallway, like news that tells itself. A teacher paused, breathed in the air, and smiled without knowing why. A tired student slowed his pace. The night shift janitor leaned against his bucket and listened to the dripping as if it were music. Lucas understood then that some changes don't ask for a microphone, they ask for constancy. When the flower reaches the hallway, it means the garden has learned to speak, Miguel said, adjusting the stake of a sprout that was asking for more sky. Together they placed 3 small pots in the library. Peace, breath, hope. The crooked spelling had become a signature. Whoever borrowed a book also carried away a bit of good silence as a gift. By late afternoon, Lucas was wiping down the study tables the way Miguel had taught him. Calm gestures, steady cloth, full presence. A few classmates found it strange. One girl whispered thanks. A boy repeating the year stayed behind to review equations. On the calendar board, Lucas drew a little leaf beside the date, not to celebrate the extraordinary, but to mark the ordinary that sustains. The principal walked by, noticed the little pots, and asked who was tending them. Miguel pointed to Lucas, and Lucas pointed to Miguel. Both laughed, conspirators in a secret that wasn't really a secret. It was care. They were granted a small garden bed by the wide window. 6 wooden boxes, 2 for herbs, 2 for flowers, 2 for whatever the season allowed. The hallway applauded in silence. New hands joined in. The boy repeating the year brought soil from home. The girl from the library brought labels. The teacher brought pruning shears. Miguel coordinated without seeming like a boss. Lucas explained watering without seeming like an owner. The garden bed was born crooked, beautiful, alive. Someone wrote with chalk along the baseboard, "Whoever cares." belongs. That night, when the building rested, the garden breathed deeper. Lucas lingered a minute longer, gazing at the signs. Home, name, Diego, Lucas. He understood then that a house is not where the streets end. It is where care begins. The wind swept through the window and carried the fragrance down staircases and across floors, as if the entire school were learning to pray without words. On a Saturday, beneath timid sunlight, they held what they called an open class. The garden doors thrown wide, tables set in the hallway, a few curious parents, teachers with coffee in hand. Miguel placed on the table the dented watering can, the small metal trowel, and a brown envelope filled with seeds. "This here is curriculum," he said simply. "Seed, soil, water, time, light, and shadow. Whoever learns this, learns people." Lucas spoke little. He showed the corkboard calendar, the crooked signs, the routine that had steadied his mind when nothing else could. "Failure was my ground. You taught me how to water it," he said, looking at Miguel, and the words landed on those who heard them like something meant to be kept. The hallway felt wider, as if the school itself had opened its ribs to hold more air. Miguel then summed it up. "The secret of life isn't to win every time. It's to cultivate what we've been given until it grows roots, flowers, and fragrance for others. The rest is just noise." There followed a silence that didn't ask for applause. It asked for commitment. A sixth grader raised his hand. "Can I start with a paper cup?" Miguel smiled. Every miracle starts small. Charles appeared without warning, a dark suit under a bright Saturday. The principal recognized him from the headlines. Lucas recognized him from the weight in his chest, which, this time, did not crush him. The father stopped before the little signs. Read name, read home, read Diego, lingered on Lucas's fingers, stained with soil. "You're caring," he said, as if discovering a language he had never spoken before. Lucas nodded. "It's what I can guarantee every day." Miguel stepped forward with the watering can and offered it without ceremony. Charles held the dented metal between thumb and forefinger, as if handling something foreign, and poured water at the base of the rose bush with visible effort. "I don't know the measure," he admitted. "We learn together," Miguel replied. The suit seemed a little less heavy. There was no speech, only a brief request. "Show me later how to set the stake." Lucas's heart breathed like a window opening after a long winter. In the background, someone wrote on the board, "Morning? Transplant." The fragrance drifted once again through the hallway, and for an instant even the glass of the aquarium far away seemed to fog from the inside, a sign that the house had begun to learn a different air. At the end of the open class, only 3 remained: Miguel, Lucas, and Charles, surrounded by good soil and simple words. The father held the stake with fingers that had only ever known contracts, and Lucas guided the motion, like someone returning the path to a man who had forgotten how to walk it. The rose bush accepted the support without fuss. The hallway breathed its fragrance like silent applause. "Like this?" Charles asked. "Like this, slow and every day," Miguel answered. Then the janitor pulled a brown envelope from his pocket and placed it in Lucas's hands. "The last seeds? Number the first of another season," he repeated softly, almost like a prayer. "A miracle isn't what falls from the sky. It's what we cultivate in spite of the sky." Lucas looked at the sibling pots, Diego and Lucas, and understood that names, too, have roots. His father rested the dented watering can on the table, in no hurry to give it back. When the doors closed, the hallway carried the scent of home. Lucas walked to the wide window and counted his breaths in eighths, not from fear, but from gratitude. The secret of life is to care for what we've been entrusted with, until it grows roots, flowers, and fragrance for others, he told himself, and the phrase settled like ground beneath his feet. On the way out, Miguel lifted his eyes to the sky and smiled, and the miracle took form. A boy finding his own name, a father learning to water, a Latino janitor teaching the world that constancy is another word for love. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell to receive the next narrative. Share in the comments. What daily act of care will you begin cultivating from today? Who knows? Your small gesture may be the beginning of a miracle that brings fragrance to other lives. May your silence find a garden, and may your name find a home.